Let's dig deep into container networking model. First of all, we have host network infrastructure. This includes both software and hardware infrastructure details like using Ethernet or Wi-Fi and host OS kernel network stack. In our case, Linux network stack. On top of that, we have Docker networking drivers, which include network and IPAM drivers. We just recently stated that functionality briefly in last lecture. On top of these drivers, we have Docker Engine, which creates individual network objects. As you might have guessed, user-defined or default container network objects fall on top of Docker Engine since they are provisioned by it. These blocks are a part of Docker itself. On top of our container network, we have running containers which are accompanied by at least one endpoint. I said at least one because it is normal for a container to have connected to two or more networks and hence consisting of more than one endpoints. Speaking of endpoints, they are container-side connector representation of virtual Ethernet, which is the common protocol for networking across Docker. They contain networking information such as IP address, virtual physical address, and ports. As mentioned earlier, if a container is connected to more than one networks, it will have more than one corresponding endpoints which will contain different IPs. The scope of these IPs would typically be limited to the host in case of single host implementation. Within the same scope, if two containers are connected to the same network, they can also communicate via DNS, where container names can be used instead of IPs. Container networks provide this information to network and IPAM drivers. Then, network and IPAM drivers translate these requests into host network supported packets and transmit them to make sure containers can communicate to the outside world. Because if that doesn't happen, forget Nginx, you wouldn't even be able to execute apt-get update command properly. So, this is how container network model works. In next lecture, we will look at network driver types in detail.